France was one of the richest and most powerful kingdoms in Europe. Its army was feared. Its culture shaped an entire continent. And yet, within just a few years, its monarchy would collapse. Not because of invasion, not because of military defeat. What could bring down an entire kingdom? The answer begins with one thing: debt. By the late 18th century, France looked like a symbol of strength. It had one of the largest populations in Europe, a productive economy, and immense cultural influence. Paris stood at the center of intellectual life, while the royal court at Versailles projected wealth, confidence, and stability. From the outside, the monarchy appeared powerful and secure. But beneath that image, a financial problem had been growing for decades. France's debt did not appear overnight. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, the kingdom was repeatedly drawn into expensive European wars. Maintaining armies, funding fleets, and supporting allies required enormous sums of money. War spending became a permanent burden on the state. One of the most damaging episodes came after the 7 Years' War, fought between 1756 and 1763. France lost major colonial holdings and accumulated heavy financial obligations. Yet even after that setback, spending did not decline. Soon the French crown chose to support the American colonies in their war for independence against Britain. Politically, the decision weakened a longtime rival and brought prestige. Financially, it meant borrowing on an even larger scale. By the early 1780s, debt servicing had become one of the largest expenses of the French government. A substantial share of state revenue was used simply to pay interest on existing loans. That left fewer resources for reform, investment, or domestic stability. The government was increasingly borrowing just to sustain previous commitments. The structure of French society made the situation worse. The kingdom was divided into estates and privileged groups. The clergy and the nobility paid little tax compared to the rest of society. Most of the burden fell on the third estate: merchants, professionals, craftsmen, and peasants. The system was both unequal and inefficient, limiting the crown's ability to increase revenue when it needed it most. Finance ministers understood the danger and proposed reforms, but each attempt faced resistance from powerful elites determined to protect their privileges. As a result, the monarchy continued borrowing, postponing difficult decisions, and hoping that future growth would solve present problems. On the surface, France still seemed prosperous. Markets functioned, trade continued, and daily life appeared stable. But the financial system was becoming increasingly fragile. Like many governments before it, France relied on confidence. And confidence can fade faster than numbers on paper suggest. By the mid-1780s, creditors began to question whether the crown could continue paying its debts without major change. And once those doubts appeared, a financial problem began turning into a political one. From that moment forward, events started moving toward a crisis that would reshape not only France, but the course of modern history. By the mid-1780s, France's financial situation had become impossible to ignore. Government spending continued to exceed revenues, and new loans were no longer solving the problem. They were merely postponing it. The real danger was no longer the size of the debt itself, but growing uncertainty about whether the monarchy could continue paying it. King Louis XVI and his ministers understood that reforms were necessary. One of the first to address the crisis openly was Jacques Necker, the finance minister who took the unusual step of publishing a report on state finances. The goal was to reassure lenders and demonstrate stability. Instead, the publication revealed the scale of the problem to a wider public and increased concern rather than confidence. After Necker came Charles Alexandre de Calonne, who inherited a system under mounting pressure. Calonne concluded that only deep structural reform could save the state. His central proposal was a universal land tax that would also apply to privileged groups, the clergy and the nobility, who had long been largely exempt from taxation. At this moment, a financial crisis began turning into a political confrontation. In 1787, the crown convened the Assembly of Notables, a gathering of influential nobles and clergy, hoping they would approve the reforms. Calonne expected support from those with power and wealth. Instead, many rejected the proposals, unwilling to sacrifice their privileges. They demanded greater transparency and questioned the government's financial management, effectively challenging royal authority. The consequences were severe. The monarchy found itself trapped. It could not raise taxes without approval, yet borrowing was becoming increasingly difficult. Confidence among creditors weakened further, and the financial system grew more fragile. By 1788, additional pressures intensified the crisis. Poor harvests drove up the price of bread, placing enormous strain on ordinary people whose incomes did not keep pace with rising costs. Economic hardship became visible in daily life, and public frustration grew. At the same time, the state treasury was running out of options. Loans became harder to secure, and confidence in the crown's ability to manage its finances continued to decline. Ministers changed rapidly, but none could push through reforms strong enough to stabilize the situation. More and more observers began to see the problem as structural rather than temporary. It was no longer just about numbers in the treasury. It was about whether the existing system could adapt at all. In August 1788, faced with mounting pressure, the king made a decision that would reshape French history. He announced the convocation of the Estates General, a representative assembly that had not met in more than 170 years. The intention was simple: to solve a financial emergency. But that decision would open forces the monarchy could no longer control. When the Estates General met in 1789, its official purpose was straightforward: to solve France's financial crisis. The crown hoped that representatives of the three estates would approve new taxes and help restore stability. But almost immediately, the discussions moved far beyond questions of money. The Estates General brought together three groups: the clergy, the nobility, and the Third Estate, which represented the vast majority of the population. Very quickly, conflict emerged over how decisions should be made. The Third Estate demanded voting by head rather than by estate, a change that would give them real political influence for the first time. What had begun as a fiscal problem was becoming a debate about power itself. Many people now asked a deeper question: if the monarchy could no longer manage the finances of the kingdom, did it still deserve to govern without limits? In June 1789, representatives of the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly, claiming to speak for the French nation as a whole. This was a turning point the monarchy had not anticipated. Attempts to restrict their actions only intensified the crisis and reinforced the sense that the old system was breaking down. Meanwhile, economic conditions continued to worsen. Bread prices remained high, unemployment increased, and rumors of financial collapse spread through Paris and other cities. For ordinary people, the crisis was no longer abstract. Rising costs and instability affected daily survival. On July 14, 1789, crowds in Paris stormed the Bastille. Although the fortress itself held little strategic importance, its fall became a powerful symbol. It showed that royal authority was weakening and that political change was moving beyond the control of the crown. At this moment, the connection between debt and revolution became unmistakable. The monarchy had called the Estates General to solve a financial emergency, but in doing so, it created a platform for political transformation. The National Assembly soon began introducing sweeping reforms. Feudal privileges were abolished, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen redefined ideas of authority and citizenship. The monarchy still existed formally, but its absolute power had effectively ended. Yet one crucial problem remained unresolved: the financial crisis itself. The revolution was moving faster than the economy could stabilize. The state still needed money, and the system that had financed the monarchy was already collapsing. The events of 1789 showed how quickly a fiscal crisis could evolve into something much larger. What started as an attempt to balance budgets had now become a fundamental struggle over the future of French society, and the most difficult phase was still ahead. After the revolution began, the new political leadership inherited the same problem that had weakened the old regime: massive public debt and a fragile financial system. The monarchy had lost authority, but the economic pressures that helped trigger the crisis remained very much alive. In an effort to prevent financial collapse, the National Assembly introduced one of its most radical measures. In late 1789, it confiscated church property. The Catholic Church owned vast amounts of land across France, and revolutionary leaders believed these assets could be used to stabilize the state's finances. To turn land into usable capital, the government introduced a new financial instrument known as the assignat. At first, assignats were designed as certificates backed by the value of confiscated land. The idea seemed practical. The state would gain liquidity while maintaining confidence through tangible assets. But the plan quickly changed. As financial pressure increased, assignats began to circulate as ordinary money. The government issued larger quantities to cover ongoing expenses and debts. What started as a temporary solution gradually turned into a growing monetary experiment. The consequences soon became visible. As more assignats entered circulation, their value declined. Inflation began to rise, prices increased, and confidence in paper money weakened. Many people preferred to hold silver and gold rather than rely on a currency whose value seemed uncertain. Markets became unstable. Shortages appeared in some areas, and economic anxiety spread among both urban workers and rural communities. The revolution had promised renewal, but everyday life for many citizens became more difficult. The paradox was striking. The old monarchy had been criticized for financial mismanagement, yet the revolutionary government faced many of the same constraints. Spending remained high, expectations were enormous, and political instability made long-term planning nearly impossible. At the same time, tensions with neighboring monarchies were escalating. War seemed increasingly likely, and military preparation demanded even more resources. Once again, external conflict threatened to increase state spending, repeating the cycle that had contributed to the crisis under the old regime. By the early 1790s, economic uncertainty began fueling political radicalization. Inflation and shortages were often blamed on enemies of the revolution, adding fear and suspicion to an already volatile situation. Financial stress was no longer simply an economic issue. It had become part of political struggle itself. What had begun as an attempt to solve a debt crisis through financial innovation was now producing new risks. The revolution changed institutions and ideals, but it could not escape the realities of money, trust, and economic limits. The financial question, once handled quietly by ministers, had moved into the center of public life. And as instability grew, the revolution entered its most dangerous phase. By the early 1790s, France was experiencing deep political and economic instability. The financial crisis that had begun years earlier was now intertwined with revolutionary change, social pressure, and growing external conflict. The monarchy still formally existed, but its authority was rapidly fading. Economic conditions continued to deteriorate. Inflation caused by the expanding supply of assignats weakened purchasing power, while rising food prices placed enormous pressure on ordinary citizens. For many people, daily life became more uncertain, and the promise of revolutionary change increasingly mixed with frustration and anxiety. At the same time, France faced mounting international tensions. In 1792, the country entered war against several European monarchies that feared the spread of revolutionary ideas. War demanded vast resources, soldiers, supplies, and funding, further straining an already fragile financial system. The political consequences were profound. In August 1792, crowds stormed the Tuileries Palace, and royal authority effectively collapsed. King Louis XVI was arrested, and the monarchy ceased to function as the center of power. A crisis that began with debt and financial reform had now transformed the political structure of the nation. As the revolution became more radical, economic hardship intensified political conflict. Leaders increasingly linked shortages and inflation to internal enemies, arguing that opposition and speculation were sabotaging the revolution. Suspicion grew, and fear shaped political decisions. In January 1793, Louis XVI was executed, a symbolic end to centuries of monarchy. Yet this dramatic moment did not resolve France's financial troubles. War continued, government spending remained high, and inflation persisted. Efforts to control prices in markets often produced unintended consequences, including shortages and black markets. The revolutionary government found itself facing familiar limitations. Despite new political ideals, it still had to manage debt, finance military campaigns, and maintain public confidence in the currency. Structural problems that existed under the monarchy did not disappear simply because the regime changed. The link between economic pressure and political escalation became increasingly clear. Financial instability fueled public anger, which in turn accelerated radical political actions. What began as a fiscal crisis had evolved into a transformation of society itself. France's experience demonstrated how financial stress can destabilize institutions gradually, then suddenly accelerate change once trust begins to disappear. Debt alone did not cause the revolution, but it acted as a powerful catalyst, pushing events forward faster than anyone expected. And as the old order vanished completely, the question remained: what broader lesson could be drawn from a crisis that started with numbers in a treasury and ended with the collapse of a kingdom? By the mid-1790s, France had become a completely different country. The monarchy was gone, the political order had been radically transformed, and society had endured years of instability and violence. But when we look at these events from a distance, one thing becomes clear. The chain of change began long before revolutionary slogans filled the streets. It began with financial pressure, a slow, persistent force that gradually weakened the foundations of the state. Public debt by itself was not unusual. Many European powers operated on constant borrowing, but in France, a specific combination of factors made the situation far more dangerous. High military spending, an inefficient tax system, and strong resistance to reform created a structure that could no longer adapt to changing economic realities. As debt payments consumed an ever greater share of the national budget, the government found itself facing limits it could no longer ignore. Attempts to reform the system quickly turned into political conflict because financial changes threatened powerful interests. This was the moment when an economic problem became a crisis of political legitimacy. The calling of the Estates General in 1789 was intended as a financial solution. Instead, it triggered a political transformation that could no longer be controlled. The fiscal crisis opened the door to broader questions about representation, rights, and the very structure of power. When a state begins to lose control over its resources, it often begins to lose political control as well. The revolutionary government soon discovered that it faced many of the same constraints as the monarchy it replaced. Efforts to solve the crisis through new financial tools, such as the assignats, led to inflation and new economic shocks. The lesson was clear: changing political systems does not automatically solve structural financial problems. Historians often emphasize that the French Revolution was not caused by debt alone. Social inequality, Enlightenment ideas, and political conflict all played crucial roles. Yet the debt crisis acted as an accelerator, pushing events forward and making change increasingly unavoidable. Seen from a wider perspective, this story reveals a recurring historical pattern. When governments postpone financial solutions for too long, hoping that growth, prosperity, or new borrowing will fix the problem, their systems gradually become more fragile. The loss of confidence, whether among creditors or the public, often becomes the point at which events begin moving faster than leaders can control. France became one of history's clearest examples of how deeply economics and politics are connected. The debt crisis did more than weaken the country's finances. It reshaped the structure of power and altered the balance of Europe itself. That is why the story of late 18th century France remains important today. It is not only a story about the past, but a reminder that financial stability and political stability are inseparable. Debt rarely destroys a country overnight. Instead, it makes a system vulnerable until one decision, one crisis, or one mistake triggers a chain reaction. That is exactly what happened in France before the Revolution. France was not a poor country. It was a country that believed for too long that it could live with debt without consequences. And when the money ran out, it was not only the economy that collapsed. An entire system, one that had seemed permanent, fell with it. And perhaps the most important lesson of this story is this: financial crises rarely begin as revolutions, but sometimes they end as one.